This is the CUNYCast, smart voices, good stories, and thought-provoking conversation from the City University of New York. I'm Rick Firstman.
Washington had an enslaved African chef as well, as did many of the founding fathers. If you think about it, if you then, take a little step back and look at it, it's like, oh my Lord, let's talk about this. Let's, bring this a little bit out of the closet. And that's kind of what I've been trying to do.
Jessica Harris never set out to become the country's foremost authority on African-American cuisine. Her doctoral dissertation was about French theater in Senegal, and she went on to a 50-year career as an English professor at Queen's College and a faculty member in CUNY's trailblazing Sikh program. But along the way, she wrote a dozen acclaimed books about, as she puts it, the food of Africa and what happened to it when it got to this hemisphere. The titles tell the story. High on the Hog, Iron Pots and Wood Spoons, Sky Juice and Flying Fish, Beyond Gumbo, and The Welcome Table, to name just half. It's a body of work and a career that dispels any notion that African-American cuisine is just your basic soul food. In fact, Harris says it's the backbone of American cuisine itself, no less influential on the culture than African-American music and dance. She's a beloved figure in the food world, and earlier this year, Jessica Harris was honored with the James Beard Foundation's Lifetime Achievement Award. She's also written about travel, reviewed theater and books, and recently published her personal collection of postcards depicting Africans and their descendants in the American diaspora. We talk about all of it on this episode of the CUNYcast. Jessica Harris, thank you so much for joining me on the CUNYcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, congratulations on receiving the James Beard Lifetime Achievement Award. Wonderful award. It recognizes your celebration of African American and African culinarians and their influence on food and American culture. So tell me, how would you describe how you got here? What has been the driving force on this wonderful career you've had?
I think the answer is random. Very, very random. I started out in food completely by accident. I was originally, my training and background are in French and theater. My doctorate is on the French-speaking theater of Senegal, and my master's from CUNY at Queen's College was on in French, with a thesis on le renouveau de Don Juan sur la scène contemporaine. So it was very, very French. And then I somehow or other, just through affinity, ended up doing some freelance writing, ended up working for Essence magazine back in the 70s, and at some point was asked about food. So I started to write about food and travel and culture. And I tell people that I was doing that. I don't know if it's quite before Tony Bourdain was born, but I've been doing it for a long time.
What do you think grabbed you? And you did this almost, as you say, randomly, but it stuck and became your career. Why do you think that was?
Well, I'm not sure that it actually became my career. I spent my tenure at Queen's, and I literally spent a half a century at Queen's College. I taught in the Sikh program there by affinity and by choice. And my half a century career was first in French for the first 7 years or so, and then in English. I taught English composition. So the food stuff has always been sort of a growing avocation. It was not my career by any stretch of the imagination. I think it struck a chord. It allowed me to put a lot of things together. From my doctorate, I was involved with the African continent and also with the culture of the African continent. It also made me travel there. And when I traveled there, I managed to taste things, to see things. My mouth told me about connections and linkages that I then, being a curious person, had to go look up and figure out. So that's kind of how it happened.
You wrote in a dedication of one of your books, and I'll read it so I don't mess it up. To the ancestors who slaved, served, survived, and created a cuisine from a sow's ear, and to the African-American cooks, chefs, and culinary entrepreneurs now and yet to come who honor the food, serve it proudly, and keep the circle unbroken. There's a real poignancy to those words that goes much deeper than what's on the table. Can you talk about that?
Well, I mean, I think the thing is that that the African American hand in the American pot, if you will, is so vital and so crucial that it is unspoken. If you think of the conditions of enslavement are such that you're at the bottom of the food chain. You are doing someone else's bidding. That's part of the notion of being enslaved, and many, not all, but the majority of African Americans who were brought to this country, certainly in its formative years, were initially indentured, but very shortly thereafter enslaved, which meant they grew the crops, they planted the crops, they grew the crops. I run this down usually whenever I speak, so if it sounds formulaic, forgive me. But they grew the crops, they planted the crops, they tended the crops, they grew the crops, they harvested the crops, they processed the food that had been harvested, they cooked it, they served it. Well, they cooked it, they set the table, they served it, they cleared the table, they washed the dishes and put them away. And then if you want to get basic about it, they emptied the chamber pots. The entire food chain was in many cases the hands of the enslaved. So if you think about it in those terms, it's logical that they would have had an enormous impression on certainly the food of the nascent country. Now, if you also factor in everyone has, at some point in life, perhaps, not everyone, but many people, have given a recipe to another. And sometimes those people prepare it for you when you come over, and you taste it and go, interesting, but not mine. And I think that's what happened in the hands of many of those African Americans. A transformative thing was taking place. People were transforming. People were adding their own, what the French would say, je ne sais quoi. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's something that was added. The Chinese have an expression, the wok hand, and it means the hand of the cook in the pot. If we take the thing that I talked about first and add that notion of the wok hand to it, you begin to see that this whole notion, this whole thing of African American hand in the American pot is that unknown, that thing that you don't see but you sometimes taste. You taste it perhaps more in the food of the American South than you do in the food of the North, but you taste it.
What do you think is the most important way that the African American experience and everything you just described has influenced cooking in the United States and by extension the culture?
Well, I mean, I think people, if you say African Americans have had an incredibly formative hand in creating the music of the United States, everybody's, oh, sure, of course, we get that. If you say African Americans have had a formidable and formative role in creating the vernacular dance of the United States, everybody goes, yeah, get it. Why does everybody have such a hard time with food? It's the same formative role. It's the same bedrock position. It's just there. If you look at rock and roll, Elvis didn't invent hound dog. We all know, and most of us acknowledge it. So the whole idea is when you begin to think about food, perhaps because food is so ephemeral, perhaps because food is not tangible in the same way that dance or music may be considered tangible, if they may, then why is that concept so hard for people? But it seems to be. I mean, arguably, the potato chip was invented by an African American. It was
See, I didn't know that.
a gentleman in Saratoga who took the British game chip, made them thinner, and voila, the American potato chip. Now, there are people who naysay there are arguments about that. Gumbo in New Orleans. Gumbo, the word gumbo, arguably, because there are always people who want to say, oh, no, that wasn't African Americans, that was Native Americans, or that was Asians, or that was fill in the blank. But the word for okra, which is often an ingredient, not always, in gumbos, in the Bantu languages of Central Africa, Central Western Africa, ochingombo, kingombo. If you want okra in France, if you're at the Rue Mouffetard in Paris and you go to a market and you see okra and you want to buy some, you ask for gombo. Why wouldn't we think gumbo might be gombo? We've now learned that Nearest Green taught Jack Daniels how to distill. Okay? And the list goes on and on and on and on. In fact, I am proud to be the lead curator of a show at the Museum of Food and Drink that was scheduled to open on the 3rd of April that unfortunately, due to our current confined circumstances, has not yet opened. But it's called African/American, Making the American Table, or Making the Nation's Table. I've got the subtitle wrong. But the point simply is, it's evident. I mean, Jefferson had an African-American cook, James Hemming, Sally's brother. He valued his culinary skills so highly that when Jefferson was the plenipotentiary ambassador from the nascent United States to the court of Louis XVI, he sent for James to come to Paris to be his cook and apprenticed him to the highest levels of culinary skill in France, including the Duc de Condé, who was a relative of the king's. Highly valued culinary skills. Washington had an enslaved African chef as well, as did many of the founding fathers. If you think about it, if you then, take a little step back and look at it, it's like, oh my Lord, let's talk about this. Let's, bring this a little bit out of the closet. And that's kind of what I've been trying to do.
What's the best thing in the exhibit?
The centerpiece of the exhibit is pretty much speaks to what we're talking about. It is actually a quilt that we commissioned. And there are 400 panels on the quilt, and each panel is a story about African Americans and food in the United States. And there are blank panels, and then there will also be a virtual quilt, and people will be able to leave their own stories on a quilt as alongside the quilt that is the physical, tangible quilt. But the point is that so many of these stories are ongoing and being researched daily. When I wrote High on the Hog, which I believe came out in 2011, people didn't necessarily know the story of Hercules, George Washington's chef, but who escaped, by the way, from Washington and ran away. And no one knew the end of the story, but it turns out that he may very well have remained in Philadelphia and had a life in Philadelphia. So people are digging. Things are being found almost on a daily basis. It's one of those gold mines, if you will, for researchers and lovers of history, and of course for lovers of food.
Yeah, there's so much to be found in food that tells about history and culture, right?
Right. Well, when I wrote my first book, which was, it came out in 1985, it was called Hot Stuff, a cookbook in praise of the piquant. And what was interesting then was, I guess, me more than anything else, and it was my methodology. I read Columbus's diaries. I read Marco Polo's diaries. The interesting thing about food is, since it is such an inherent and intimate part of the human condition, everyone, and I do mean everyone, thinks about it at one point or another. What time is dinner? Wonder what I'm going to have for dinner. Gee, that was weird. We're going to feed me more of that? And these things turn up in people's diaries and people's travel accounts and all sorts of things. So there's a lot of stuff out there to research.
So tell me something about your own cooking.
I keep saying I haven't killed anyone yet. I hope not to. I have cooked for as many as 70 people, but in my house, under my circumstances. I've overseen and on some cases cooked in restaurant kitchens or cooked with chefs in restaurant kitchens. But I'm not a trained chef. I have trained chef friends who look at me and go, "Oh God, Jessica, you're a one-knife cook." And it's like, yeah. And it's a paring knife sometimes, so, But, at this point with the confinement, I have 4 pans. I was just telling a friend who is also a cookbook author about that just this morning. I have a grill pan, I have a wok, I have a skillet, and I have a saucepan, and that's it. I'm not the person who is going to necessarily be posting 12 pictures of the trout stuffed with a whatever topped with a hunana on Instagram, because that's not what I eat. In many cases, it's not what I write about, and it's certainly not what I cook.
So what is your favorite food or some favorite to cook or eat?
Oh, I'm a pretty simple eater. I tend to eat grilled meat. I still eat red meat, so grilled meat or fish or chicken. Vegetables. My mother was actually a trained dietitian, although she didn't work at it by the time I was born. But as a trained dietitian, I grew up eating, there was always an array of color on the plate, because there was a green vegetable, there was something that was orange or red or pinkish, and then there was something else, a starch, so it was a balanced meal according to the old notion of what a balanced meal was. And there's always a salad. I have a salad every night with whatever, unless I'm having a salad as my main. But that's I'm a very sort of relatively simple eater. I love condiments. So I love to add flavor via condiments, probably, which is my way of doing it.
Anything unusual?
I just did an article for a magazine with for New Yorker's very peculiar title of Garden and Gun. It is a southern magazine, so the gun is about, dove shoots and things like that. But on watermelon rind pickles. And so I love pickling. I have been known to, although I haven't done it in a while, this may be my summer to start it again, to do some canning. I make chutneys, or I've made chutneys. I haven't made them in a while. But things like that are the things that I do to add flavor to what I cook.
Right. Well, I've got to ask you about cooking and eating in the time of coronavirus, the quarantine. Are you, have you turned to comfort food, or is all food comfort food for you?
No, not by a long shot. I have, in some cases, turned to some of the comfort food of my youth. I have someone, bless her, she is my editor, and I am now referring to as my sainted editor, because at the beginning of this she said, "Jessica, my husband and I have a car. We live in Brooklyn. We're going to shop every Friday. Send us your list on Thursday. We will deliver it to you." So I literally have not been shopping. Now that's an editor. Oh, no, my God. She's more than an editor. She is, a sister at this point. She's always been a dear friend, but she's even dearer than she was, if that were humanly possible. But I asked at some point for, those slices of American cheese and a loaf of white bread, and I've been making grilled cheese sandwiches. Occasionally, not all the time. Sometimes grilled cheese and tomato, sometimes grilled cheese, tomato, and bacon. that would be a youthful comfort food. I can't tell you when I had a grilled cheese sandwich before this. And a couple of weeks ago, I asked for some Campbell's chicken noodle soup and some Campbell's vegetable beef soup. So that's my childhood. I mean, and I dilute them down with low sodium chicken broth so that I can eat them without feeling too guilty. But and then I put my leftover vegetables, that orange stuff and pink stuff and yellow stuff from the night before, and maybe some of the rice along with the noodles in there to kind of, so one can of soup lasts for a while.
Yeah. Well, it seems like food is a big part of getting through this ordeal. You read about people. I think for a lot banana bread is king. Right?
Well, no, sourdough. I read
sourdough.
I read somewhere that someone had named her sourdough starter Blob Marley. So I mean, people are naming their sourdough starters. You're in trouble. Right.
Well, this is kind of maybe some sort of a revolution. Maybe this will change eating in some ways. Maybe
well,
not.
It's definitely going to change restaurant eating, and it probably will change some things about dining and entertaining. But the thing that I hope it changes the most is, I do truly hope it has taught us or will teach us gratitude. And I hope that the gratitude that we are feeling for people who are helping us through this continues and stays vivid and alive once we are through this. Because that's important.
I wanted to ask you about your world travels. You've been all around the world and had a lot of adventures and written beautifully about them. What has sort of kept you searching? It seems that there are revelations everywhere you go that you write about.
I mean, I don't even know. I think it's just, I am a curious person. I can't say questing, but it's not as though there's a quest, because I don't know what the grail is that I may be looking for. But I do know that I think travel is informative. It tells me who I am. You learn more about yourself probably when you leave your comfort zone than when you remain in it. So that travel does that for me. I think also the UN school, I don't know if I've referenced it, but I'm the first non-UN person to go to the United Nations International School. And so I grew up with people from all over the world. And what that has done is given me a familiarity with some of the world's cultures, just from, childhood affinity and friends. But equally, it's given me what I sometimes call a cultural fluidity. I am able to not necessarily be an absolute part of, but to fit in. I sort of have an almost intuition of manners and how to be appropriate in some cases, or I'm at least very conscious of the need to be appropriate. I know that in last year in January, I went to China, and it was essential for me to be able to speak some words of Chinese. So the first thing I learned how to say was, I don't know if I'm going to remember it now, but whoever hears it who speaks Chinese can have a big old giggle on me. 我很高兴来到这里, which means I am very honored to be here, or something to that general effect. And it was astounding to people that I would not so much speak Chinese, because I'm sure they had seen other African Americans who spoke Chinese, but that I, as a guest there, would have made the effort to learn how to say that. And I think that's the other thing. I think we, travel requires a degree of politeness, or appropriate travel. And I like to think of myself as a traveler or a voyager and not a tourist. Tourists don't have to be polite. Tourists do what they do, and that's it. But travelers have to be mindful in another kind of way, and I know that's who I try to be, and I know that that's important.
Well, it's a perfect segue to you have a new book, Vintage Postcards from the African World, it's called, with the subtitle, In the Dignity of Their Work and the Joy of Their Play. So tell me about that.
Well, for, I guess, 40 years or more, I have collected antiquarian postcards. And when I say antiquarian, some of them are over 100 years old. The collection started out by being a way to illustrate some of my books. The collection just grew and grew and grew and grew. I've got things like rum labels. It's ephemera, but the postcards are the bedrock of it. I've got, I keep them in shoe boxes. Bad for me. I need to be better about it. But, I've got several shoe boxes. I probably have 1,000 or more postcards. And 150 or so of them are assembled in this book. The book's guiding principle, if you will, is the postcards are about literally what the subtitle says, the dignity of their work and the joy of their play. These are people in the illustrations who are either under colonialism, the early ones. In fact, all of the African ones are about colonialism. All of the Caribbean ones are about colonialism because the cutoff date for the cards is something like the 1930s or 40s. So they all predate the end of colonialism. In the United States with the cards, these are people in the cards who are the first generation or so out of enslavement. And so dignity was an important word to put in the title because there is a dignity in their faces, a dignity to their work, a dignity to they're doing what they had to do. And that's another thing that's reinforced today. We are learning about how much we need people who are often to us invisible, without whom we couldn't be the way we are in the world. The mailman, the grocery person, the nurses and doctors we may be more aware of, the bus driver, the food market people, the farmers, those migrant workers that we don't necessarily think about, but who are harvesting, that kale that people are making salads out of. There's one picture that I love of a woman, I think she is in Martinique, but she is one of the women who carried on their heads loads of coal to fuel the ships, the transatlantic ships, the steamers that were going back and forth the Atlantic in the days when they used coal as fuel. And there were women who would carry these bins of coal on their head up on the ship to stock the boiler rooms. So dignity about that work, but also the joy of their play.
I just wanted to talk a little bit talk about your teaching career. As you mentioned, you taught at Queens College 50 years, and you were part of the Sikh program the entire time. Tell me about your experience with that program.
Oh, well, the Sikh program, it was, for me, my heart at Queens College. I think I arrived in the program in its second or third year. I think what I loved most about it was the students. I just found that the students, particularly within the Sikh program, were just, I used the word quest earlier, but they were questers for knowledge. In many cases, first generations in their families to go to college, something that I could identify with, a first generation to complete college. And something that I found was absolutely worthy of encouragement and necessary and beautiful in its own way. And that's one of the reasons that I stayed, because that part of it was very, very special.
Is there something you learned as a teacher? I'm sure there are many things, but something that kind of gives the sweep of it?
I learned something from every class I ever taught, every class. And sometimes it was massive transformational, light bulb going off in your head. But sometimes it was just a little thing. But whatever it was, there was always a lesson.
Do you miss it?
I do. I do and I don't. I mean, I retired voluntarily, so I didn't get kicked out or pushed out. I'm not sure I would enjoy the online teaching that people are doing now. Basically because I was such an interactive teacher with my students, and that would be difficult. I don't know, difficult. One adapts, but it would be different for me. I like to think that I am able. I like to think that I still have an agile spirit so that I could have picked it up and run with it. But remember I taught writing. And I think some of that requires a little bit different thing from another kind of give and take that computer things and computer classes can give you.
Right. Well, you're certainly keeping yourself busy.
That for sure.
And
yes.
And sooner or later we will get out of this, and I hope you're able to collect your James Beard Award in person at some point.
I hope so too. I look forward to that day.
Right. Well, congratulations again, and thanks so much for talking with me.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me on. You take care and stay well.